And then we'll be hearing from Mickey Huff, Professor of Social Science and History and Co-Chair of History and Journalism at Diablo Valley College, as well as Director of Project Censored. We have our third speaker this morning for our first session, and it is Mickey Huff. Mickey, welcome. Take us away. Yep, there you are.
Here. Okay, so I'm here now. Good, good.
So I'm definitely here now.
As I mentioned earlier, I think the ironic word of the day, right? Irony. Irony is the ironic word of the day. We'll get into our meta-technological loops through Zoom. It's really an honor to be here. I'm sad that we're not in person, but this is a pretty interesting way to still congregate. And again, I keep saying irony, given that so many of these technologies have the ability to bring people together and to sort of elevate who we are as a society. As we just heard, these very same technologies and forces are used to do, well, very different things. In fact, very opposite things, more technologically dystopian things. Though Ruha ended on a really high note. It's an honor to be here with you, and certainly always with Russell, the great work that Russell's done. So it's an honor to be here, Ken. I'll be brief, which is odd, but I'm going to respect everybody else's time, and there's other sessions going on, and I'll be on later on today. So many things crossed my mind, of course, listening to the first two people speak. And the one, of course, is where we started off our book. Nolan Higdon and I started off our recent book, The United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It. It's a City Lights book, of course, and one of the great writers, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, his publishing house, once wrote that our government is a bird with two right wings. They're devoted to the perpetuation and spread of corporate capitalism. And that's our techno-dystopia in a nutshell. We have the alleged benevolent democratic use of Silicon Valley technology that somehow makes things better by tracking everything we do in some Huxleyan nightmare. And then, of course, on the other side of the spectrum, and the Democrats are involved in this too, but certainly we've seen starting post 9/11, really strong shift technologically to be surveilling people, doing a whole host of other more Orwellian things with that kind of technology. So here we are now in what I was calling a COVID 911 world. The current pandemic has yet given more opportunity for technology to be, well, used to exploit, used to sort of, as Ruha was saying, sort of perpetuate the worst exploitative and oppressive tendencies in our history. Or also we look to technology to see, well, how will it be our savior, right? The whole, does it enslave us? Will it save us? Again, that kind of riff, I think, is quite brilliant. And, when I teach a moral economies course on digital media, occasionally, that's just the constant dilemma. That's the dilemma through the whole term, really. And so what we were doing when we in this United States of Distraction book, we really focused on how did we get to this point. And I like the title here is on new media and technology. We're focusing on how we can use technology in the future, not let it use us. We started the book out with a great quote by Lao Tzu that many of you may be familiar with, and I think it's a great riff, for the rest of the day. If you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. Well, where are we heading? If we're heading in the world that Russell pointed out, right, there's some hope that we could use institutions that were designed for the public support to regulate corporate influence. Well, maybe we could be heading somewhere else. If we use the technology that Ruha was talking about to create more justice and more equity, we could be heading in a different direction. What my research seems to suggest is that we're really not heading in that more positive direction. And if past is prologue, it seems as though that we have to do a lot more of these kinds of events that don't just talk for the day and share our important information and findings, but we have to find a way to get this information to everybody else that's not zooming into a conversation like this. I like the language that Russell had used earlier I thought was pretty interesting, and it's a language that we often use, and it's about media consumption and media consumption habits. And this kind of goes back to that "where are we heading" thing. Ken, you can cut me off when you need to. But the idea, these data collection companies and this whole surveillance capitalism industry, they want us to give over more and more information. So the more media we consume, the more these companies consume us and increasingly consume and then spit back out our identities to us. So it's another part of that really strange information loop, meta loop, if you will. And I'm reminded that when we talk about media consumption, Mark Crispin Miller, the media scholar at NYU, I think adeptly pointed out that when we talk about media consumption and what media do we consume, I think we're also giving over a lot of our power to these information disseminating institutions that control journalism, right? And such that when we consume things, it's as if we're just kind of like, here's some junk food, some chips, some whatever. And we're just kind of throwing things in. We're consuming them. We're consuming media. We're consuming so much junk food news and propaganda and distraction that I think that we need to think more critically about what it is actually that we are consuming, so that then we're making critical choices. There's no denying we live in a consumer society, a commercially addled society, a media saturated society. But I think that we're really at a crossroads. Some of course might suggest that we're already through the crossroads onto the dark side of things. But I like to think that we can really use a lot of this kind of information, the technology, certainly the things that we were just hearing from the previous two speakers, to sort of steer us in a different or more productive direction. And I think that there's two things specifically, two areas that we can really focus on, to be brief. One is really transforming our educational sphere to be more public, more civically literate, more media literate, and to look more at compassion, cultural competency, empathy. We really have to retransform the pedagogy of our schooling and education system, because as the Lao Tzu quote goes, if we're not careful, we'll end up where we're heading. Well, where have we been heading that way educationally, pedagogically? We've been moving way away from critical thinking, independent thinking. We've been moving way away from honoring people's curiosity and what they can give back to society. And we've been training generations of people that are takers. What is in it for us, and how will this technology get us what we, quote, need, right? Which is really veiled terminology in commercial platforms for what we want and what we're programmed to think we want, versus really looking more deeply inside of us as human beings and what we need to not just be better people, but to create a more just and equitable society. The other is we really need a vibrant public journalism. And of course, I know Russell and I were talking before this. He just got done teaching Victor Picard's amazing book, Democracy Without Journalism. Just had him on the Project Censored show, where we've been really talking about this. And I did use that terminology, COVID 911, as an emergency kind of language. We respond in crisis, right? And so there's these strange opportunities. I don't get to quote Rahm Emanuel very often, but you'll recall he's the one that said, never let a crisis go to waste. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Of course, they cynically meant that as a way to bail out Wall Street and continue the transfer of wealth to the 1% and suppress people's civil liberties and so on. I mean it very differently, right? And I see a lot of the things that are happening the rest of the day. I see that as an opportunity. I see a lot of the things and the subjects and the people that are here today, that Ken, Amber, that you all put together here for all of us. I see that as an opportunity of how do we create a better, how do we use the technology and the media that we have to create a better, more just society, a more well-informed society, not one that's more befuddled and more distracted in our hyper-partisan, confirmation biased media silos and filters, but one that really honors critical thinking, critical inquiry, and one that really teaches us how to keep conversations going rather than shut them down. And I think journalism, when done right, really models how to be inquisitive, how to be communicative, and sort of how to honor people's differences in ways that we can sort them out to sort of sift through what the best possibilities are. And I wanted to kind of close things with a reminder from our good friends at the Society of Professional Journalists, in their code of ethics, this goes back nearly 100 years. If you go back and just take a look at some of the simple things that they talk about and that they say should be part of a vibrant free press and a solid journalistic core in the US, that's been gutted at least in half in the last 20 years. They claim that we need to, and I think that this is true of all of us, not just journalists, we need to, number one, seek truth and report it. We need to minimize harm in the process of seeking truth and reporting it. We need to act independently. We need to, we need to be very clear about, who is controlling the message, right? We need to try to be in control of our own messaging. And then, of course, be accountable and transparent. And we can show people that we're independent. We can show people that we're sincere. We can show people that we're trying to minimize harm and seek truth and report it when we're accountable and transparent in the things we say and in the things that we do. And I think that if we model that in our education, in our journalism, in our personal communication habits, I think that a lot of the technology that we have could be used for good and could move us in a good direction. I'm going to wrap up here, but I couldn't help but looking at these algorithms and these bots. The last Project Censored show takes a look at the censorship on YouTube of LGBTQ community. Andy Lee Roth had done a great article with us and another one in Index on Censorship, and just did an interview here with a lawyer suing YouTube over their biased sort of AI and bots and their algorithms. And this riffs on what Ruhav's saying, certainly what Russell was hinting at. And there's this idea that these are somehow neutral, objective, just sort of banal technological platforms that are here for our use. And rather what's going on is these things are all using us. And I think that we need to take back from them that kind of power, and we need to be very careful about how we're consuming that kind of media and information. In the land of AI, Andy Roth and I wrote in Through the Looking Glass, Censored 2020, we need a world where there's a lot less A and a lot more I. And I think that I'm pretty sure that today we're going to be getting a lot more I, right, and less of the A. And even though we're using technology to do this, I think this will be a great opportunity to show that technology can work for us and not against us. And again, I hope everybody is doing well during the current crisis we're in. But I also hope that people can remember in the process of that, keeping more I, more intelligence, that we can also talk about really complicated and controversial things, because we are at our best, I think, as human beings when we don't operate out of fear, but we operate out of hope and possibility, and we can bring about the better world we imagine. So again, it's really an honor to be here with all of you today, and I look forward to hearing many of you throughout the day, and I'll be back at the end of the day to kind of wrap things up. But again, thanks so much for having me here. Concision is not a strong point of mine, so hopefully it didn't ramble too much.
Thank you, Mickey. That was great. We're a bit over in time, but I think we've started. It's just really, I feel great. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm really happy to be here. That said, Zara has been tracking to see if any of you have added questions to the chat box. Zara, do we have any?
If we're heading to a technocracy, is it still run by the 1%?
The first question is, is it going to be controlled by the 1%? That kind of depends on everyone here, and particularly what Dr. Benjamin was talking about. This is also inclusive of folks working in the arts and humanities and recognizing the patterns that you're either contributing to or starting to change. And you are in a moment where change is still possible. It is absolutely in flux. It isn't quite baked into stone yet. That's not a good metaphor. You get what I'm talking about on a Saturday morning. So things aren't completely baked into space. I'm going to give up with that and hand this over to some of my other presenters before I make any worse comparisons. Please save me.
No worries. I mean, in terms of that question about the 1%, I definitely, I think it's important to understand the power mapping in the way that Russell did, in terms of the corporate interests, in terms of the nexus of political and corporate interests and so on, to get a clear enough sense of the fact that what we're seeing in the technology context is not a complete break from what we see in so many other industries, right? In terms of that monopolization of resources and power. But what I was trying to also point to in the examples that I gave, starting with the Citizen app, is that we also need to really reckon with, you might call it a kind of bottom-up demand for certain kinds of surveillance, the conveniences that targeted advertising brings and so on. So if we only tell the story as a story that's looking up at what's happening to us, we ignore our own complicity in it and the way that our own, not just consumer habits, but really the way that our imagination gets captured by certain kinds of desires for whether it's certain notions of security. Right now, I think we have to be very aware of how fears around public health are going to create a bottom-up demand for forms of surveillance that will likely not go away just because the pandemic gets under control. And so, yes, let's look at the kind of the way that a small group of interests and elites are trying to capture both resources and imagination, but let's also look for the border patrols in our own minds, right? Look at the policing that we do interpersonally, the way that we, like when I talk about Citizen and other apps, like the discomfort that many people who use all of these surveillance devices on their homes and their doors and so on feel, because, you know, it gives them a sense of security. So we also right now can take stock of that and figure out what's actually serving the collective good, or some privatized notion of security that in the end is not going to serve us.
Well done.